Hello, and welcome to the second Sunday in Ordinary Time. Our readings today focus on the call of God to us, His children. Now, Samuel, from our first reading, is sort of a unique figure. He had a unique life as the temple boy. His mother, Hannah, had wanted a child for many years. She was married to Elkanah, and he was a nice guy. He loved her and all. He was a good husband. But as was traditional in those days, Hannah wasn't the only wife. The other wife, named Peninnah, had many children, and she used to rub it in Hannah's face all the time, with the classic, nanny, nanny, boo-boo, I've got more kids than you do, and the like. And she would tease her and upset her mercilessly. Now the husband would always say to Hannah, now why do you weep? Why do you grieve? Why do you refuse to eat? Aren't I worth more than 10 sons? But Hannah was not convinced that he was worth more than 10 sons. She was not consoled. She was deeply, deeply sad and bitter. So she goes to the temple, and she prays. And she's praying in her bitterness, it says, silently. But she's moving her mouth, as people do sometimes. And Eli the priest sees her, and he thinks she's drunk. He tells her to quit making a scene and sober up. She tells him she's not drunk, just sad and troubled. She's bringing her problems to the Lord. So Eli tells her to go in peace. May God grant what you have asked. Now what Hannah had been praying for, what Hannah had been asking God, was for God to give her a son. And she made a vow to the Lord that if God gave her a child, she would in turn give that child to the Lord. No wine or liquor shall he drink. No razor shall touch his head, she said. He will be a perpetual Nazirite and live at the temple in service to the Lord, Hannah prayed. Now, to be a Nazirite meant to take vows, usually for a specified period of time, a certain amount of days, a certain amount of months, a certain number of years. But sometimes it was a permanent vow. Now, the vows were to abstain from wine, to not cut your hair, and to have no contact with corpses. These vows are found in the book of Numbers, chapter 6. And people who took these vows and professed themselves to be Nazirites were regarded as being set apart or dedicated to service to God. Samuel was to be a lifelong Nazirite, as with Samson in the book of Judges and John the Baptist in the Gospels. By the time of Jesus, it was quite common for people to do temporary Nazirite vows. They say that the Apostle Paul, the Apostle James, and even Jesus himself may have taken Nazirite vows for specified periods of time throughout their life. So Hannah is setting her unborn son up for a lifetime of Nazirite service to the Lord as part of her prayer to God, asking for a son. Now, technically in the rules, only a father could promise his son to God, but God didn't let that get in his way. Now, as he always does, God answers prayer, and sometimes he even answers in a way that we can understand. And in this case, he blesses Hannah with a son, Samuel. And when he was weaned, she brought Samuel to the temple to present him to the priest, along with a 3-year-old bull, a bushel of flour, and a skin of wine. Now I want you to imagine, if you can, if you tried to do that today. If you just show up out here in the parking lot with a bull, a sack of flour, a bottle of wine, and a baby, 9 months after you're in here looking drunk during your prayer time, the priest is going to think you're still drunk. But it was a different time then. Eli the priest understood what was going on. He knew what the wine and the flour and the bull meant, so he brought Samuel into the temple to live and to be a servant to the Lord. Now this is where our first reading picks up. Samuel is a young boy living in the temple. And one night while he's asleep, God calls out to Samuel. Samuel hears it, he wakes up, he runs to Eli and he says, "Here I am, you called me." Eli says, "No, I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." So Samuel goes back to sleep, and it happens again. And again he runs to Eli, and Eli tells him, "I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." Happened a third time. Finally, Eli figured it out. He understood that the Lord was calling young Samuel. Sometimes God has to call us several times before we get it. So Eli tells Samuel, if it happens again, then Samuel is to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So Samuel goes to sleep. Scriptures say the Lord came, he revealed his presence, called out as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Now our reading from this morning then skips to the end and says Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, not permitting any word of his to be without effect. Our reading this morning leaves out what God said to Samuel. It leaves out God's message to Samuel. The message God gave to Samuel was about Eli the priest. Eli had been the priest for a great many years, and he had done a pretty good job by all accounts. But as he had gotten older, he had delegated more and more responsibility to his sons. You see, that's how it worked in those days. The priest's sons always trained to be the next priest. Unless, of course, some lady like Hannah shows up with a baby and a cow. Now, the Bible describes Eli's sons as wicked. They were carving out a portion for themselves of every offering and every sacrifice that the people brought in, skimming off the top of the offering basket, you might say. They were growing rich. They were eating good. They were dipping into the offerings and the sacrifices that the people brought to God. The people complained to Eli, and he told his sons to knock it off. They didn't listen. The Bible called it a futile rebuke. Another, unnamed prophet, the Bible just calls him a man of God, came to Eli and told him that the behavior of the sons had angered God and that there would be consequences. He told Eli that his 2 sons would die, his descendants would not live to an old age, that the men would die by the sword. God would raise up a new priest who would do God's will in heart and mind. But Eli didn't listen to the unnamed prophet. He continued to let his sons run wild, ripping off the people, ripping off the temple collection, ripping off God. So the message that God gave to Samuel was that Eli and his family were officially on deck for punishment, that God was about to carry out everything he had threatened Eli with. God said, "I announce to him that I am condemning his family once and for all because of this crime. Though he knew his sons were blaspheming God, he did not reprove them." Reprove means to reprimand, to rebuke. Eli knew that they were doing wrong, and he didn't say anything. It's a big deal to God if the people under your supervision are doing wicked things, and you know about it, and you do not make them stop. That is apparently a big deal. Unfortunately, this is something we all do from time to time. We accommodate a little bit of evil if it gets the job done. We see this happen over and over with our leaders too, whether it's a bishop or a politician. Everybody wants to say, "That wasn't my responsibility to make them quit doing that. We're trying to get the job done, trying to accomplish the mission. Gotta break some eggs." God will not look kindly on this abdication of responsibility out of our leaders, religious or secular. Now, poor Samuel from the story, he's just a kid. God tells him he's about to remove Eli and his family from the picture, and Samuel's supposed to tell Eli about it. Now, sometimes the message we receive from God is hard to hear. Sometimes the message we receive from God is hard to tell other people, particularly if it is calling out their injustices, their derelictions of duty, their high crimes and misdemeanors. But God doesn't send us messages so that we can keep them to ourselves. God intends for us to tell the people what he wants us to tell them. And what we can learn from the story of Samuel is that God sends many messengers, some named, some unnamed. God makes sure we know what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is unacceptable. But many times, unfortunately, like Eli, we don't really put a stop to injustices and wicked behavior. We give a futile rebuke, if anything. Let's face it, Eli needed his sons to keep running the temple for him in his old age. It's what he needed to do to survive. He was getting too old to run the place by himself, and he needed help. Who's going to help him? So his sons are a little bit evil. He's still getting the job done. That's how he's looking at it. Now, sometimes we accept a little evil if it gets the job done. Those bishops needed those problem priests to keep the parishes up and running. The Vatican needed the former cardinal to keep raising money for them. And politicians needed white supremacists to keep rounding up voters for them. We accommodate a little bit of evil, just as Eli did, in order to keep our plans going. Everybody looks the other way sometimes if we're still able to accomplish the big picture goals that we have. We think the ends justify the means, and we can convince ourselves that God agrees with us. But that's not what God thinks. That is not how God thinks. God is not looking the other way. God is not forgetting our inaction in the face of these evil actions. And that's a hard message to hear. It is a hard message to give. This is the type of message that God gave Samuel to give to Eli. And God did what he said he was going to do. Samuel grew up. A few years later, the Israelites go into battle against the Philistines, and Eli's 2 sons are killed in the battle. When Eli hears it, he falls out of his chair, breaks his neck, and dies. And Samuel becomes the high priest and the judge of Israel. Samuel, who would end up anointing David, king of Israel, whose royal lineage continued on through the generations, all the way to Joseph the carpenter and Mary his wife and Jesus the Messiah. It could have been Eli or his sons who anointed David and started the royal lineage to Jesus. It could have been one of them that played a role in the plan of salvation, but they lost their way. They stopped listening for God to speak to them. They stopped listening to the messengers God sent to them. They stopped listening. They stopped following God. God is always calling us to follow him, to follow his way, to follow his plan for our lives. Sometimes he sends messengers, like the unnamed prophet who came to tell Eli what God thought about his sons. Sometimes he sends messengers like John the Baptist, who in our gospel today told his own disciples that Jesus was the Lamb of God, knowing that they would leave him and follow Jesus. Later in the gospel, John tells his followers that Jesus must increase while he decreases. John the Baptist, the lifelong Nazarite, understood the plan, and he understood his role in it. John the Baptist listened when God called him out of the desert to proclaim that the Messiah was coming, and John the Baptist listened when God led him out of the way when Jesus the Messiah arrived. Jesus, the Messiah, is always calling out to us. He's always inviting us to follow him. He's always inviting us to come and see, just as he did the apostles today. And what Jesus shows us, what Jesus always shows us, is love, always love. He shows us how to love ourselves and how to love others. He shows us how to avoid these moral pitfalls of accommodating evil that Eli fell into, that we all fall into. Jesus shows us through word and deed how to treat one another, how to make our way through the world with humility and grace, honor and truth, trusting in the Lord to bring justice, trusting in the Lord to take care of us. Like the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, so shall our Father care for us, his most precious creations. Jesus shows us through word and deed that God's plans are so much bigger and grander than the plans that we come up with. Jesus shows us that the big picture plans that we are trying to accomplish, the plans that we think necessitate a little accommodation of evil, really aren't what we should be working toward. Jesus shows us time and time again throughout the gospel that his way leads to peace, his way leads to love, his way leads to forgiveness, his way leads to salvation. And you never have to accommodate evil to get there. It's a good litmus test, really, for our plans and our schemes and our lives. Do you have to accommodate evil to get there? Well, then it's not God's plan, and Jesus isn't leading. We're supposed to be following Jesus, professed Christians as we are. And when we start following Jesus, like these two apostles and our gospel reading today, we'll have questions. Where are we going? How will we get there? How will things be when we do get wherever Jesus leads us? How will we survive on this path? And like he told them, Jesus says, "Come and you shall see." You see, we have to let go of our impulse to control everything and just follow where the Lord leads us. We have to trust him to take care of us, trust him to provide for us, trust him to bring us where we're supposed to be, trust him to solve things in a way that doesn't include any evil. Sometimes the way is hard. Sometimes the path is difficult. Sometimes the only way we can see to move forward is to maybe do some things or allow some things to be done that we know shouldn't be happening. These are the times when Jesus calls out to us to remind us that what we're up to is not his way. He calls out to us to come back to following his way of love, mercy, peace, and truth. He calls out to us, inviting us to come back to him, inviting us back into the fold, back into his presence, inviting us to come and see his way of doing things. He always, always welcomes us back. Whether God speaks to us when we're falling asleep, like he did to Samuel, or he sends a prophet to us like he did to Eli, or Jesus calls out to us like he did to the apostles, our response should always be what Eli told Samuel to say. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." May that always be our response. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. May we always actually listen. May we always actually follow Jesus as he leads us.